Hello, everyone. Let's identify together the structures of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves on the blank figures. We will label together these two blank figures. Starting with this one, let's first identify the parts of the spinal cord. As we mentioned in the previous videos, the brain and the spinal cord, they're both part of the central nervous system. The brain is protected by the skull, whereas the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. The vertebral column consists of the cervical vertebra, the thoracic vertebra, and the lumbar vertebra. Starting with the first part on the spinal cord, this right here is the cervical enlargement. It is at the level of the cervical vertebra. The spinal cord is also covered by the three meningeal layers. In our previous videos, we mentioned the three meningeal layers and the dura folds. The spinal cord is also protected by the dura, arachnoid, and the pia mater. This right here is the lumbar enlargement, which is at the level of the lumbar vertebra. Right here, we have the cons medullaris. The cons medullaris is where the spinal cord ends. And this right here is the cauda equina. The cauda equina resembles a horse tail. This right here is the filum terminale, which is attached to the sacrum. Moving to the spinal nerves, first we have the cervical spinal nerves, C1 through C8. Then we have the thoracic spinal nerves, T1 through T12. And then we have the lumbar spinal nerves, L1 through L5. And these are the sacral spinal nerves, C1 through C5. The sacral spinal nerves, they pass through the sacral foramina. Check out my video on the anatomy of the sacrum to understand its structures. Moving to the cross section in the spinal cord, first let's go over the meningeal layers of the spinal cord. The outermost layer is the spinal dura mater. Similar to the brain, the outermost layer of the meninges that covers the brain is the dura mater. We mentioned in the previous videos that we have the meningeal dura mater and the periosteal dura mater. This right here is the arachnoid mater. And this is the pia mater. Moving to the structures of the gray matter. First, it is very important to identify the anterior from the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. You can pick any unique structure, whether on the anterior or the posterior aspect. Keep in mind that dorsal means posterior, whereas ventral also means anterior. I chose this structure right here. Looks like a bulge. This structure is only found on the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. Based on that, the gray matter, which looks like a butterfly, this part of the gray matter is the dorsal horn because it is located toward the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. Whereas this is the ventral horn. Ventral means anterior. On the side, we have the lateral horn. So the gray matter consists of the dorsal horn, ventral horn, and the lateral horn. Both sides of the spinal cord are connected via the gray commissure, similar to the corpus callosum that connects both cerebral hemispheres in the brain. Check out my video on the anatomy of the brain to understand its structures. At the center, we have the central canal. In my video on the ventricles, we mentioned that the fourth ventricle narrows down to the central canal. The central canal, it runs through the entire spinal cord. The central canal is filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. Moving to the white columns. So the gray matter consists of the neuronal cell bodies. Similar to the brain, in the brain we can see the gray matter versus the white matter. When it comes to the spinal cord, we also have a gray matter and the white matter. The white matter forms the white columns, and the white matter appears white because of the myelinated axons. This right here is the dorsal funiculus, identifying the posterior versus anterior aspect of the spinal cord will help you easily identify the dorsal funiculus versus the ventral funiculus. So that is anteriorly, and on the side we have the lateral funiculus. Moving to the dorsal posterior median sulcus. So as we mentioned earlier, that this bulge, this unique structure right here will help me identify the posterior aspect of the spinal cord. So this cut right here is the dorsal, also called posterior median sulcus. Whereas this is the ventral anterior median fissure. A fissure is a deeper cut, whereas a sulcus, right here, that is a superficial cut. Moving to the dorsal root. So from the posterior aspect, also called the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, we have the dorsal root. Whereas from the anterior aspect, we have the ventral root. Moving to the unique structure on the dorsal root, this is called the dorsal root ganglion. What is a ganglion? A ganglion is a group of neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. As we mentioned earlier, the brain and the spinal cord are part of the central nervous system. Anything that exits the brain and the spinal cord, it is part of the peripheral nervous system. So the dorsal root and the ventral root will both merge together and will give the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is this short part right here. The spinal nerve will then split into ramus. We can see right here, that is the ventral ramus, that is the dorsal ramus, and this is the rami communicants. I hope you found the video helpful. Check out my next video on the anatomy of the eye.